Hi and welcome to the channel. With the recent release of Nikon's brand new 180 to 600mm lens, which I've already been able to use in the field with the Z9, the question arises, is there a new king in town, or will the old guard like the iconic Sony 200 to 600mm lens reign supreme? In this video, I will compare the 180 to 600mm lens not only to the Sony 200 to 600mm lens, but also the Canon 100 to 500mm lens, the Nikon 100 to 400mm lens, some of the prime lenses like the f4.5 400mm lens, and some third-party lenses, and of course the Nikon 200 to 500mm lens. So let's find out which one of these lenses is the best and the right one for you. Let me start off this video by saying something that may come as a little bit of a surprise to you. Sharpness isn't everything. Of course, we're going to compare images from all these lenses taken in the field in real life conditions to see which one is the sharpest, but you can basically take fantastically sharp images with all of these lenses. There are other factors that are far more important when it comes to determining which lens is best. When it comes to these kinds of mega zoom lenses and smaller prime lenses, one key question for me is this going to be your main bigger wildlife lens, or is this lens going to be a secondary lens to like an f2.8 or f4 600mm big prime lens? Your answer to that question will affect which lens is the right one for you a lot. Another important factor when getting the most out of your lens is what camera are you planning to pair it with? Especially the autofocus and image stabilization can be heavily affected by your choice of camera bodies. Third-party lenses, for instance, have worked very well on DSLR cameras in the past, but struggle a lot more on modern mirrorless cameras because the communication between the lenses and the cameras is not as consistent anymore as it was in the past. And this is especially prevalent on Canon models where a lot of third-party lenses have quite a bit of autofocus struggles. So to get the best and most consistent results in the field, it's not necessarily important to have the sharpest lens ever made, but to actually use a camera and lens combination that work very well together and give you the best and most reliable autofocus and great image stabilization. That in return will give you a lot of sharp images, not many autofocus images, and the best overall results. Let's start by looking at the new Nikon 180 to 600mm lens. I've used it for a while in the field with the Z9, but I actually think it's best paired with the Z8. It will give you fantastic performance and the balance is a lot better and you save a few hundred grams in extra weight, which you will definitely notice at the end of a long day of hand holding the lens. The lens weighs in at just 2,140 grams or 4.7 pounds, which is not super light, but it lies well in your hand and can be handheld all day. Nikon priced the 180 to 600mm lens very aggressively at just $1,699 US, which is much cheaper than most other lenses I will be talking about in this video. It's an internal zoom and very well built, even though it's not a top of the line S-line lens. The throw is nice and firm and has a good range. It's not too short and not too long. It just works really nicely and also makes it nice and smooth to zoom for video work. Talking about video, this is where the 180 to 600mm really shines with fantastic image stabilization. The viewfinder is nice and stable and allows you to handhold low shutter speed and video without problems. It's not as good as some of the top of the line lenses, but it's very close to them, and at that price point I found that very amazing. The 180 to 600mm lens has a minimum focusing distance of 2.4 meters or 4.27 feet at the 600mm mark, which is good, but also not amazing when it comes to some of the macro capabilities that some of the other lenses will have in this video that we're going to talk about. The autofocus with the Z9 on the 180 to 600mm lens was nice and fast and gave me good results most of the time. The image quality of the lens is very good and it allowed me to achieve many fantastic photos with it in the field. And when we zoom into one of these files, we can see that there's nice details and nice sharpness. I did notice in some cases that if I stopped down from wide open f6.3 to f8 on the long end, that I could slightly increase image quality and sharpness. Unfortunately, I have not had the chance to use the 180 to 600mm lens with a teleconverter, but it will definitely work. The only thing I would expect that will happen is that you will need to stop it down to at least one stop. So you have to go from wide open f9 and 840mm to something like f11 and 840mm for maximum image quality and sharpness. So all in all, quite an entry that Nikon made into that 200 to 600mm segment, and let's see how it compares to some of these other lenses. Next up, Sony's f5.6 to 6.3 200 to 600mm lens. This lens has pretty much been the gold standard in that 200 to 600mm bracket, and that's for a reason. It's super sharp, has fantastic and reliable autofocus, and is also an internal zoom. On top of that, it's very competitively priced at around the $2,000 mark, and it weighs in at just 2,115 grams or 4.66 pounds. So it's actually a little bit lighter than the Nikon lens. It has a very short and loose throw that is easily turned with 1 or 2 fingers, which is fantastic for photography, but for video work I sometimes found it a little bit too loose where you almost zoom too fast. This is done a little bit better on the Nikon lens. The Sony 200 to 600mm lens also has a minimum focusing distance of 2.4 meters at that 600mm range. The Nikon lens beats it on the shorter end by 20mm, which is really not a lot, but sometimes it can make a bit of a difference, and the wider the better ultimately. Where the Sony 200 to 600mm lens really shined was in combination with the A9 II and the A1. I was very impressed with the autofocus of this lens with these cameras. Birds in flight, no problem. Action, no problem. Fantastic overall. If we look at some images side by side, I would say that the Sony lens has a slight edge in image quality. It's simply one of the sharpest zoom lenses I've ever used, and that shows in these examples as well. The 180 to 600mm lens is sharp, but the Sony is just a more sort of aggressive sharpness. But overall, the Nikon might produce a more smooth overall image, whereas the Sony has the edge when it comes to pure sharpness. And even if we put a 1.4 extender on the Sony lens, it still gives us fantastic image quality, and we don't even have to stop down to get those results. So that was very impressive to me overall. Where Sony lags behind the competition is image stabilization. It's noticeably more shaky than the competition of Nikon and Canon. Nikon is pretty much the gold standard where nothing moves in your viewfinder, and you can easily do handheld video with the 180 to 600mm lens, and this is very difficult if you try to do the same with a Sony camera and the 200 to 600mm lens. It will just be a lot more shaky and very difficult trying to achieve the same results. On top of that, a few Sony cameras also don't have eye tracking in video mode, and one of them is the A1, unfortunately. I was hoping Sony would update that, but they still haven't done so, and this makes it much harder for people like me that like to do some handheld video, some sort of run and gun video. In these situations, having eye tracking in the video mode like the Z8, the Z9 has, or all the Canon bodies, makes it much easier to get good results in the field. So when it comes to pure photography performance, I might give a slight edge to the Sony combo because the A1 with the 200 to 600 has amazing autofocus and great sharpness. But when it comes to being the best all-rounder, the do-it-all kind of camera, I think I would give an edge to the Nikon combo with a Z8 or Z9 and 180 to 600mm lens, because you still get great image quality and you have much better image stabilization that in return will allow you to do much better video work, and you have tracking in video mode as well. So in the end, between these two combos, it depends what you put the most importance on, I'd say. Next up, one of the most hated and misunderstood lenses, that's also one of my favorite lenses of all time, the Canon 100 to 500mm lens. I actually find it very hard to compare this lens to any other lens because it sits right between the 100 to 400mm sort of category and the 200 to 600mm category without being either of them. So it's so small, light, and offers amazing flexibility. People often complain about the f7.1 wide open on the long end, but for me, this is really a non-issue in the field. We can these days use such high ISOs that the difference between 5.6, 6.3 or 7.1 can really be neglected in the field. To me, the 100 to 500mm lens is the perfect secondary lens to my RF f4 600mm prime lens because it's nice and light, still has great reach, and offers me amazing flexibility that the big prime lens lacks. Yet, if it was my only lens, I would probably find it a little bit short on the long end if I was using it with just a full frame camera. What it lacks on the long end though, the lens makes up for it on the shorter end by offering us 100mm, which is fantastic in the field and allows us to capture nice and wide shots at times. For instance, I was photographing cassowaries in the pouring rain on a beach, and I was able to capture this wide shot of the bird walking on the beach with 100mm. And a few minutes later, I was able to capture this awesome shot zoomed in at 500mm of a second cassari, throwing up nuts in the air and then eating them. And I could do all that in the pouring rain without having to change lenses, which was really great for me and not something you could achieve with many other lenses. The 100-500 being an external zoom lens also makes it very small and light, weighing in at just 1,365 grams or 3 pounds. So it's significantly lighter and smaller than the Sony 200-600 or the Nikon 180-600mm lenses. It also has an amazing minimum focusing distance of just 95 centimeters or 2.9 feet at 500mm. So for emergency macro work in this field, this lens can also be fantastic and is very versatile. The autofocus of the lens with basically all Canon mirrorless bodies is very fast, extremely accurate, and the lens produces outstanding image quality, very similar to the Sony 200-600mm lens and ahead of the 180-600mm Nikon lens for me. It also handles both teleconverters very well. You're getting quite up there with the f-stop if you add teleconverters to the lens, and there's one really bad design flaw when you use the lens with teleconverters, because you cannot zoom back any further than 300mm, which can be quite annoying because then it often doesn't fit in your backpack with the attached teleconverter anymore, so you always have to take it on and off. The image stabilization of the 100-500mm lens in combination with like R5 or R3 is very good. Not as good as the Nikon combos, but definitely ahead of Sony. So you can easily do handheld video and handheld low shutter speeds. Yet, even with all the praise, I still find it hard to make a choice between 100-500 and like a 200-600mm lens, because ultimately when it comes to shooting small subjects, the 200-600mm lens will still have an edge because you can shoot at like f6.3 at 600mm, something that you can't do with the 100-500. You're like at f8 or f9 when you're at the 600-700mm mark. So there's definitely an edge there with the 200-600mm lenses. At the same time, the 100-500mm lens is so small and flexible that it makes for the perfect do-it-all kind of lens or secondary lens. So in the end, it comes down to your shooting style and your way of wanting to use these lenses in the field. Of course, you could use something like an R7 on the 100-500mm lens to get you more reach, but then you'll have slightly more inconsistent autofocusing. The biggest downside, of course, with the 100-500mm lens is the price of $2,900 and actually a lot more in most other countries. So it's definitely not a cheap lens and you're paying a lot for that flexibility. Now that we're picking the right lens for you, it's also important to learn image editing to get the best results out of the images that you take in the field. And I would love to show you how easy it can be with my Pro sets and my masterclass. With my Pro sets, all you need to do is install them in Photoshop or Lightroom, go to the Profile drop-down menu, select the right Pro set for your image, click on it, and you have perfect colors and a great starting point for the editing process. It's that easy. And from there, you can take the image into Photoshop and follow my masterclass where I teach you step by step everything you need to know to make your images shine and get the best possible results. I show you cloning, curves, layers, liquefying, color correction, everything you need to know to get fantastic results. So make sure to check out these two down there in the description. Next up, Nikon's 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6 lens. Just like the Canon RF 100-500mm lens we just talked about, this lens also offers us fantastic flexibility in the field. It weighs just 1,435 grams or 3.16 pounds. Being an external zoom allows for the size to be quite a bit less than the 180-600mm lens, and the weight difference of 700 grams is definitely noticeable in the field. The 100-400mm lens has a minimum focusing distance of just 75 centimeters or 2.5 feet, allowing us for great magnification and the great use as an emergency macro lens. It has nice and fast autofocusing, great sharpness, and fantastic image stabilization. Low shutter speed photos or handheld videos were not a problem at all. The image quality is very good, and when we compare it side by side with the 180-600mm lens, I would give the edge to the 100-400mm lens, but the difference is actually not that dramatic. What do you guys think? As we all know though, 400mm is not necessarily enough for wildlife, so if we want to get towards the 600mm with the 100-400mm lens, we need to put on the 1.4 teleconverter. I've shot with that combo a fair bit in the field as well, and I've gotten pretty good results. I even got some doves in flight with that combination on the Z9. It was very tricky to achieve focus on the birds, but when it hit it, I actually got some fantastic results like this bronze-shouldered dove in a nice banking pose. And when we look at some portraits and closer up shots here, we can see that even with the 1.4 extender attached, the lens still gives me fantastic results and great sharpness. However, to get the best results, I would recommend to stop down one stop for increased details and sharpness. And even with the 2x teleconverter, this lens still gave us somewhat good results, but then you definitely had to stop down. However, if we compare the 100 to 400mm lens with the 1.4 extender to the 180 to 600mm lens, I'd say that the image quality becomes very similar, but the 180 to 600mm lens actually has a bit of an edge in the field now because it's wide open at f6.3. So if you're after one lens that can kind of do it all, that works alright with the teleconverters, can do emergency macro work, gets you from 100mm to 400mm with great autofocus, great image stabilization, and great image quality, then it's quite hard to pass up the 100 to 400mm lens. However, when it comes to maximum reach and price, the 180 to 600mm lens has a clear edge because the 100 to 400mm lens comes in at around $2,700 and then you will also have to buy a 1.4 teleconverter that will add a few hundred extra dollars on top of that already big price tag. So when we compare prices, the 180 to 600mm lens definitely has an edge, costing more than $1,000 less than the combo of 100 to 400 with the 1.4 extender. Before we move on to some prime lenses, let's compare the 180 to 600 to its predecessor, the f-mount 200 to 500mm lens. This is one lens that I haven't used much in the field at all, only really one afternoon, but from my experience back then, it was pretty slow when it comes to the autofocusing. Sharpness seemed fine, but it just felt overall a little bit heavy and definitely slow when it comes to the autofocus. I asked a few friends who've been using this lens for years and they agreed with my assessment, especially the autofocus seemed to always take a little while to jump onto the subject. Once it's there, you get some nice and sharp images, but it definitely had slow focusing. My friend Mike Ashby was kind enough to send me a few raw files that he took with the D500 and the 200 to 500mm lens, so we have a few images to compare. Side by side, I'd say that the 180 to 600 definitely has a little edge when it comes to stuff, image details and sharpness overall, as you would expect on a newer camera with a newer lens with better coatings and everything new pretty much. To me, the 180 to 600mm lens basically trumps the 200 to 500mm lens in every regard. It's lighter, especially when we also count the need of using the adapter on the mirrorless lenses. It has faster autofocus, better overall image quality, and just handles better overall in the field with better image stabilization as well. If you're in the market for a new lens, I think the 180 to 600 is a no-brainer. If you already have a 200 to 500, it depends how much you're willing to spend to upgrade to a lens that is better overall, but maybe not a monstrous update. Unlike most other companies, Nikon has a few quite small, lightweight and relatively affordable prime lenses in that sort of 400 to 600mm category as well, namely the f-mount 500mm 5.6 PF lens and the new Z-mount 4.5 400mm lens. Both of these lenses are very small and very light, and they weigh almost a kilo less or 2 pounds less than the 180 to 600mm lens. So they're definitely interesting contenders in this space. Prime lenses usually have slightly better image quality, especially with extenders, and just overall better build performance, and there's just no moving parts in the lenses. So they're definitely nice to use, but you're giving up a lot of flexibility. On top of that, these lenses also cost significantly more than 180 to 600mm lens, so that's something to keep in mind, but I think there's still interesting choices in this space. I've used the 500mm PF lens extensively adapted to the Z9 and I had very nice results with it in the field. It's nice and sharp with good details. The autofocus works relatively well and the image stabilization also works quite well, although it doesn't work as well as on the newer Z-mount lenses. The image stabilization on those lenses is simply second to none. On the older lenses it's good, but you have a lot more sort of little bit of shaking compared to the newer lenses. It also handles a 1.4 extender very well. That gives you a f8 700mm lens. The image quality of the 500mm PF lens compares well to the 180 to 600mm lens, but when it comes to overall performance in the field, I would probably give a slight edge to the 180 to 600mm lens, simply because it's newer, you don't have to adapt it, it has fast autofocus and better image stabilization. So I think overall, the 180 to 600 has an edge, especially also when it comes to video work and handheld video. This is where I didn't have the best results with the 500mm PF lens. The f4.5 400mm Z lens is the only other lens in this video that I haven't used extensively in the field. I also only used it briefly for one afternoon, so I don't have the biggest field experience with it, but I got my friend Fabian, who also has a YouTube channel, check it out down in the description. He also made a full review about this lens to send me some files that he took with that lens, so we have something to compare with. And looking at these files, I think the image quality is definitely excellent of that lens. Looking at the photos, I think we can see that the image quality overall, as expected, of the prime lens is slightly better than the 180 to 600mm lens, but the differences are not dramatic. The 4.5 400mm lens also seems to work quite well with the 1.4 extender, giving us a very nice and lightweight 640 f6.3 lens. Of course, probably stopping down will help a little bit with sharpness, but even wide open, this lens seems to perform very well with the 1.4 extender and makes it quite an interesting option. Now it really comes down to, do you prefer zoom or prime lens? I think both of these lenses are excellent choices. They both have great image stabilization, great image quality, great autofocusing. So do you prefer to have a prime lens that has a slight edge in image quality and maybe a little bit faster autofocusing? Or do you prefer to have the zoom lens where you can zoom back all the way to 180mm and all the way out to 600mm, giving you more flexibility? I would find it very hard to pick between the two lenses, so what's your pick? Do you have one of the two, or do you have one and order the other one? Let me know in the comments. I've used my fair share of third-party lenses over the years in the field, and while they work well, the main reason to buy them is cost. Usually they come with a significantly lower price tag than the native manufacturer lenses from like Sony, Canon or Nikon. In saying that, while the price is very attractive, I've personally never really come across a third-party wildlife-orientated lens that outperformed a native lens. So a native Sony, Nikon or Canon lens usually outperforms the third-party lenses, especially when it comes to the image stabilization and the autofocusing. So while they still work and you can definitely get some nice and sharp images with these lenses, there's some issues between the communication with the camera and the lenses that can sometimes lead to some frustration in the field. In terms of image quality, it's actually quite surprising how good some of these third-party lenses are, and that's definitely not the problem. If we look at some of these sample files here, you can see they're all nice and sharp when they hit. The main problem is that they don't always hit and you have a higher sort of out of focus image rate. So that's the main concern, and the other concern, as I said already, is the image stabilization. It's usually not very good and just doesn't work as well with the IBIS in the camera as the native lenses do. So handheld video with the third-party lenses really didn't work out too well for me whenever I tried it. When we compare most third-party lenses now to the new 180 to 600mm Nikon lens, I think you can make a compelling case for the Nikon lens. It's quite aggressively priced within like a few $100s of a lot of the third-party lenses. So I would personally try to go for a lens that's a native lens simply because I know I will get the best performance and the best communication with the camera. We also have a few honorable mentions here at the end that I just want to throw in as some ideas if you somehow don't like any of these lenses I've talked about so far. There could be the Canon R7 with the 100 to 400mm RF lens. This is a very small, very lightweight combo that gives you an effective focal range of 160 to 640mm wide open at f8. So if you're after something that's not too expensive, still nice and sharp with good overall image stabilization and decent autofocus performance, even though it's a little bit spotty on the R7 from time to time as well, this could be a very interesting combo that weighs less than 2 kilos or 4 pounds and costs less than $2,000 or just above $2,000. So that could be an interesting way as well to get you to the 100 and something to 600mm range. One lens I've never used in the field myself but heard only good things about it is the Sony 100 to 400mm lens. It also seems to be excellent at everything I said about the Nikon 100 to 400mm and Canon 100 to 500mm seems to be true for that lens as well. It has a good minimum focusing distance, great image stabilization, even though probably not as good as Nikon and Canon, great autofocusing and fantastic sharpness, and it also seems to work with the extender. So this could be an interesting, very versatile lens if you're in the Sony lineup. Canon, of course, also has another excellent 100 to 400mm lens, the version 2 EF, and that adapts very well to the new mirrorless lenses. Personally, I prefer the 100 to 500mm lens over it because it's just overall better, faster autofocus, better image stabilization, better image quality, and an extra 100mm. But at the same time, the 100 to 400 version 2 is no slouch and performs very well in the field and has great image quality. It starts to fall apart a little bit if you put extenders on the lens, so it's a little bit harder to work with it, and you definitely have to stop down for maximum image quality, but it's still a very nice option if you're looking for like a used lens, for instance. There are of course other brands out there like the new Fuji 150 to 600mm lens that's wide open at f8, and on that Fuji crop body actually delivers some nice image quality as well, and there's a bunch of different Olympus offerings of course, but for this video I wanted to stick to the big three brands and lenses that I've actually used in the field a lot to give you my true field experience. There's so many fantastic lens options out there these days, aren't there? Personally, given the choice in this sort of 100 to 600mm range, I would personally opt for zoom lens because it just gives me more flexibility in the field and still fantastic image quality and overall performance. Which one is the best lens of all of these is actually very hard to say for me, and I don't really think there's one clear winner. Nikon is definitely going to stir up the market with the 180 to 600mm lens because it offers fantastic performance, good image quality, and a fantastic price point that even attacks the usually much lower priced third-party lenses. So I think they're going to sell a lot of these lenses and they will perform very well in the field for all of you who are going to get one. What makes Nikon stand out the most to me is actually their amazing image stabilization. It's literally magic. You can have any of their new Z-mount lenses, you look through the viewfinder and it basically doesn't move. Even in stronger wind, you can handhold video and it basically doesn't shake at all. I don't know how they're doing it, but it's simply amazing, and it is what makes these lenses and cameras truly stand out. The autofocus has definitely come a long way from the days of like the Z6 and the Z7, and it's much improved in the Z8 and the Z9, but compared to Canon and Sony, it definitely lacks a little bit in consistency and subject recognition and just overall ease of use. With Canon and Sony, you can usually turn the camera on, press a button, and the autofocus will work. With Nikon, you have to work a little bit harder to set it up and get the best results in the field. So if I had to pick an overall winner that is great for photos and videos, gives me good performance and just overall fun in the field, I would probably pick a Z8 with a 180 to 600mm lens. It just ticks all the boxes and performs very well and has quite an attractive price point. At the same time, I think for pure photography, a Sony A1 or like an A9 II with the 200 to 600mm lens has a slight edge over the Nikon combo, but it doesn't work as well for videos. So overall performance, Nikon, pure photography, I see an edge with Sony. And if you're after one do-it-all kind of camera and lens setup, then like an R5 with the 100 to 500 could be an excellent choice for you. It's a little bit shorter, but it still works with the extenders. It gives you fantastic minimum focusing distance and still gives you the great reach of 500mm as well, which is a little bit shorter than the other lenses, but at the same time you're also gaining on the wide end with being able to shoot at 100mm. So overall, as a one lens do-it-all, this is a very attractive setup. Which one of these lenses have you picked? Do you have a favorite? Are you gonna switch around, switch brands, switch lenses? Do you currently own a Nikon lens and gonna dump it and get a 180 to 600mm lens instead? Let me know in the comments. Also give me a thumbs up for the video. I'd love to hear from you what you think about all these different lenses. And of course, hit that subscribe button and I will see you guys in the next video very soon. Bye.